Hey everybody. So we're going to be looking at chapter 7. This will be looking at the end of the Roman Empire in the West. We'll be looking at the beginning of the Roman Empire in the East, what will be called the Byzantine Empire. We're going to look at the evolution of Christianity. We'll also look at European invasions, probably. Some of the European invasions, or sometimes referred to as Germanic invasions. Which helped bring down the empire. That's what we'll be looking at in this, in about a little over 3 centuries, from 284 CE to 600 CE. Okay, so this is Vandal General Stilicho and his family. Now, the Vandals were one of the Germanic tribes. Why do we look at this? This was a general who was born into what they often refer to as the barbarian peoples. We still sometimes refer to them as barbarian peoples. The Romans heard their language and they said it was like bar, and that's where barbarian comes from. It was insulting. That's really where the term comes out of. Nonetheless, by the end of the Roman Empire, barbarians are playing an increasingly significant role for a variety of reasons. This is a really significant one. He was born as a barbarian. He was born as a Vandal. Over time, this Vandal empire, this Vandal kingdom, starts to overtake big chunks of the Roman Empire. And eventually these barbarian tribes, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, lots of others, they're really what bring down the empire. Why is this so significant? Because he was a Vandal, a barbarian, and he actually rose all the way up to be a general in the Roman military, even though he was not from Italy. He was not from Italy, and he was just a European person. This really signifies a lot of change. Really, it does. It identifies how Rome had changed. How Rome had been an empire of the Roman peoples for 1,000 years, but by the end, and I think I mentioned this in the previous chapter, Rome really wasn't Roman any longer. The people who were there were not even Roman peoples. The vast majority of the population were outsiders, foreigners, non-Italians. And so it's really interesting. The Roman Empire doesn't exactly collapse. It just sort of fades away. It's like one day it's there, and then one day it just really isn't anymore. In the West, Europe, Italy. But it does continue for another 1,000 years in the East as the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. It's interesting. All right, so from the Principate to Dominate in the late Roman Empire, remember these are sort of the names of the dynasties. The Principate, which was started back by Augustus, the beginning of the empire, and this is the Dominate is the next dynasty that we call it in the late Roman Empire. Political transformation and division of the empire. All right. Diocletian was the first person to try and restore order and secure the Roman Empire after about 100 years of loss and chaos. Now, if you remember where we ended the previous chapter is generally around the year 180. That is when things, sort of the end of 200 years of peace, generally peace, or at least prosperity for Rome, not really peace for Rome's enemies. Then we have the better part of a century of chaos and civil war, bunch of different emperors, assassinations, client armies fighting each other. Honestly, it's really surprising Rome didn't fall in that 180 to 280 period. So after this years and years of violence, we get an emperor who rises to power from nowhere, really. He's a nobody, and he eventually brings peace to the empire for a period of time. He was born as an uneducated peasant. His leadership, his courage, his intelligence propelled him through the ranks of the military and the army, and the soldiers actually proclaim him emperor in 284, following decades of war and chaos in the empire, in which the empire had lost vast amounts of territory and citizenry. The army actually declares him emperor, and he is emperor. Now, in order to make his strength more visible and to make it more effective, Diocletian, he imposes probably the most autocratic rule in Roman history. Autocratic, meaning one man with all the power. Now, you might think an emperor had always been that way. Well, even with the emperor, there'd still always been the Senate. There'd still always been a big government. So lots of other people were involved in ruling and controlling Rome and its provinces. Diocletian takes almost all the power. It's no longer a facade. We're no longer pretending like it's a republic anymore, as so many emperors said that they were just leading a republic. He just takes all the power for himself. He calls it, or we, I suppose historians named it, the dominant, from the Latin word dominus, and the Latin word dominus means master. He was the master of the empire, the master of everything. He gets away with any shared authority. He forgets about the idea of any type of equality with the people. Basically, the elites have all the power, and even then, the power they have is only given to them by Diocletian. Emperors during this period of the dominant, and the dominant lasts for many years. During this period of the dominant, they lead in a very grandiose style. They have lots of embellishment. They really display their wealth. They really almost appear like emperors. They've always been emperors, right? They've been emperors since Augustus, but they actually start looking like emperors. Remember Augustus? Augustus dressed like a normal educated man, a normal upper-class man, like any other man you would see on the street. Not every emperor did that, of course, but he really throws away with all the pretense, and it's basically he's now a god emperor. That's how he wants to be treated, sort of like the Persians did. He uses elegant garments, elaborate ceremonies. People can't touch him. People can't even be close to him. They can't breathe the same air he breathes. He can no longer be anywhere associated with ordinary people. They use strict laws, brutal punishments, really strict and brutal. But they stop the fighting. It's peace through incredibly strict laws and martial rule, really, in this time period. Now, to combat this threat of fragmentation and the empire coming apart, Diocletian actually divides the empire into 4 districts. That might seem counterintuitive. But the idea is he divides it into 4 administrative districts, which are much easier to govern. Instead of trying to govern one massive empire, you're now sort of governing, you have an emperor leading each of the four. You have 2 in the west, which is Europe area, 2 in the east, which is more towards Asia and I guess Africa. Each one has its own capital city. Each one has its own army. This was his style to divide this so that it would be easier to govern and control than trying to govern one emperor trying to rule the entire empire. He thinks the government is be much more in contact with the local peoples and local governance, which will simply make it easier to rule, as almost like 4 smaller empires, yet all still connected. He thought this made more sense to deal with invasions and things like this. The local armies will be more likely to do that. He establishes this tetrarchy, with tetra meaning 4, this tetrarchy, to where he appoints 3 other partners, basically 3 co-emperors. And each of these co-emperors rules one of these districts. He's the main emperor, so basically they're all like assistant emperors, if you want to put it that way. They were supposed to be loyal to him and supposed to follow him, and then of course whenever Diocletian left, one of them would be elevated up to the supreme emperor, then they'd have a replacement. It sounds nice if it worked out. If it worked out like as we say, if it worked out like on paper, great. But the thing is, it didn't really work out as nicely as it seemed. He also then subdivides the provinces into different territories, making them even smaller units. And this is where we get the actual term the diocese, which is what is used by the Catholic Church to designate like provinces or regions of authority in the Catholic Church, which is logical. Catholic Church based in Rome. This is Rome doing this. It's logical that they sort of just carried it over into a religious view as well. And each of these dioceses, there's like 12 dioceses. And so even a further subdivision with local governors. He really creates a really intricate and, again, on paper, or whatever the hell he wrote it on, a good bureaucratic system. And had it actually survived, maybe it would have worked. Maybe it would have actually held Rome together. But you know what? All these people who have this high status, they want power, they want status. Yeah, it certainly didn't work as well as it might have thought it could have worked. Despite this attempt to eliminate conflict, Diocletian's successor, who was Constantine, he had to fight a long war to actually take power. He had to fight a war for years, actually. He took power in 306, but then he had to go to war with the co-emperors, and it was a huge mess. Because when the emperor dies, the co-emperors, every one of them wants to be the emperor. You don't want to be a co-emperor again, plus you're going to get older. Hell, if you're co-emperor for another term, you're probably going to die and never get to be the emperor. So it was a messy, but he does manage to actually fight and maintain his position as the new emperor. Fearing his partners, his co-emperors, would try to unseat him or assassinate him, he gets rid of them. He eliminates the tetrarchy, and it's now gone. So we have a system which really seemed like it might actually function well, fails completely due to people's desire for personal greed and power and glory. And, I mean, who doesn't want to be a god emperor? I mean, really? You going to turn that one down? Hey, do you want to be the god emperor, the greatest empire in the world? Or do you want to be his assistant? I mean, come on, really. Everyone wants to be the man, not the assistant to the man. Nonetheless, it was messy. So he founds the city of Byzantium, which is Constantinople, Byzantium, same city. He founds this. He renames it to 324 to his Constantinople, which is named after him. And this is now the new Rome. I think he even lives there. I think he even goes to Constantinople, which is actually Asia. That's actually right there. It's I can't really tell you. Maybe you'll see it here on a map in a second. But it's Constantinople, Byzantium, and later it becomes the capital of the Byzantine Empire. He designates this the New Rome. He does this around 324. He also chooses his 3 sons as heirs to the throne. Chooses all 3 of his sons to be heirs to the throne. However, after he dies, what do you think the 3 sons do? If you've been paying attention at all for the last couple chapters, you know exactly what happens. The 3 sons immediately take their armies, go after each other, each one vying to be the emperor. They go to war with each other, start killing each other off and killing innocents and using their armies against each other. And immediately, there's another war, another rivalry. And eventually this ends up with the empire effectively split into 2. Effectively, the empire, and this lasts for years, again, the sons and the next generation, it goes on forever. And by 395, we start to officially say there are 2 empires now. There is now the Eastern and the Western Empire. They're pretty much 2 different empires. They were all Rome, but now we have 2 Romes, and ruled by 2 different emperors. An emperor in Constantinople, or Byzantium, whatever you want to call it, and then an emperor in Rome itself, the city of Rome. And we get the Eastern and Western Empire. And the Western one, Rome, falls here in about another 50 so years, and then the Eastern Empire survives for another 1,000 years. Byzantium does. The permanent capital in Rome, actually, they change it to Ravenna. They change it to the city of Ravenna, believing Rome is no longer safe. Ravenna is smaller, more easily defensible. Rome has been attacked. Just in the 300s, Rome was, I think, sacked by barbarians 2 different times. Rome has been invaded by Roman armies 12 times. And of course, Rome is massive. It's too huge to protect. There's still, it's probably not the million population it used to have at one point, but it still has a large number of people, lots and lots of poor. So the emperor actually moves to Ravenna, which is, I think, more north, more close to actually Europe, and it's perhaps more easily defensible and a lot less people to have to deal with. It's really interesting. Oh, there it is, Ravenna. Yeah, Constantinople and Ravenna. All right, here we see the map. You can see Rome here is city of Ravenna, more easily defensible. Here is Constantinople, or Byzantium, same city. And this becomes the Eastern Roman Empire. And you see the districts here. The 4 districts are Diocletian, Galerius, Maximian, and Constantius. Not Constantine. That's not the same one. That's a different one who I just mentioned. And we have this as the Eastern capital and this as the Western capital. But remember, up until about 395, it was still the same empire, just ruled by separate rulers at different times. Sometimes the capital, they used the capital as Byzantium, sometimes used as Rome. But after 395, it's pretty much always ruled jointly as sort of 2 separate empires. Jointly might be the wrong word. Maybe separately is more appropriate. After 395, the East and the West go different directions. They start to really do things differently. This is another problem. One of the things that helps bring the empire down. The West is often left on its own to deal with all of the Germanic invasions from Europe. Not to mention invasions in Northern Africa, not to mention invasions from Mediterranean and pirates, and of course, all the people that already live. We have uprisings in Spain, we have uprisings in Gaul here, which is, what eventually becomes France. And we have these uprisings that go around, and you also see the dioceses on here. You see each of the different dioceses. There's about 12 of them. They're in red, so you got about 12 of those as well. All right, and here you can see this official division between East and West. Italy, Constantinople. It's divided here with Greece in the east. And also, it's another interesting thing, since I mentioned Greece there. We find that in the east, the language really becomes Greece, Greek. Greek becomes the language most commonly spoken in the east, while in the west, the language spoken is still Latin. And they also divide up Africa. Egypt is in the east, and this is in the west. The west really starts to fall in hard times, while the east actually starts to thrive. And probably why? Enemies saw the weaker of the two being the west, and so they jumped on it. And so the west got constant invasions, while the east was either, when it did get invaded, they were able to fight them off, protect themselves. The east is actually smaller. Really, the east only had to worry about Greece, this part of Asia right here in Europe, and then Egypt. It actually was a much smaller, this map is a little deceptive. The west had to deal with all of northern Africa and all of Europe. Much, much bigger, a lot more people to deal with. Okay, so Diocletian's reforms carried high financial and social costs. He reorganized the entire empire. He changed everything. So lots of costs to this. In an effort to control inflation and support his huge army needed to, of course, maintain this massive empire and to keep the peace, which he did, really expensive. To defend the borders, he imposed price and wage controls, as well as a brand new tax system. Basically guaranteeing people a certain wage, which some businesses simply couldn't pay, and to establish set prices so people couldn't overcharge prices. The idea was to really control the economy and to establish a very standard and fair economy to try and make sure everyone is able to get what they needed. Because one of the reasons people will rise up, one of the reasons people will seek alternatives or go to war is if they're starving or they are being subjugated or oppressed or whatnot. The new taxation system as well. In 301, he imposed some interesting stuff. A whole new system of these controls. The mandate, it's a mandate, which means you had to follow these controls, you had to follow the prices, you had to pay these certain things, and you had to only charge certain prices. Well, it was incredibly ineffective because most merchants weren't willing to do it. The reality is, if you have something that you can sell for $1 and make $1, great. But if you could sell for $5, you're going to sell for $5, right? Of course you are. The emperor comes in and says that has to be sold for $2. But I can sell it for $5. So anyway, a lot of people ignored it, and they couldn't enforce it. I mean, it's an empire with 100 million people, give or take. Kind of hard to enforce. I mean, for that time period, impossible to enforce, really. They hoped everybody would agree and cooperate, but it didn't work very well. Really, all it did was make things worse on the population, and it really just, how to put it, it created unrest. It created many people upset, many people angry. All right. Desperate to control this, to try and deal with this unrest and the fact that everybody's ignoring these controls, he imposed all kinds of restrictions. He makes certain occupations compulsory to where you have to do a certain job, and it's also hereditary, which means if you have kids, your kids have to do that job as well, because he needed people producing certain goods. Well, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it totally inhibits social mobility. You can't work your way up anymore. You are now stuck having a low working job, a low level job. You're stuck with it. Your kids are stuck with it. It's permanent. Even a much further long lasting effect of this is this actually translates into European society in years later. And this becomes standard practice in Europe over the next 1,000 years, to where the father had a job and he would train his son to do a job, and they would always do that job. So if your father was a blacksmith, you would be a blacksmith. Your kids would be a blacksmith. And it would be passed down generation to generation. This became standard in European society, which meant there was no social mobility. It's almost a class system. Whatever spot you're born into in society, whatever level on the social ladder you're born, you're going to be that forever. And rarely, I'm not saying never happened, but rarely did people ever break out of that slot they were put into literally the moment they were born. This becomes a standard system in Europe, part of the entire feudal system, if you're familiar with what that is, which we will talk about. All right, we'll go on into the coloni here. Coloni are farmers, which had traditionally been free to move around. A farmer could move around, find better jobs, find better land. They could buy land, they could sell their farm, they could grow different crops, things like this. Increasingly, they are now being told under this new system implemented by Diocletian and his successors that you have to stay on that land. If you grew corn before, you have to always grow corn. We're actually going to make contracts. We're going to write it up to where we can always count on you on this farm, in this place, providing 6 bushels of corn every single spring or fall, or however it works. I'm not a farmer. And you will do that, which has people stuck on the land, and this is part of this hereditary system. Everyone does, all the way from bakers to soldiers. It becomes standard to where whatever you did, your son must do. I mean, if it's a good-paying job and you're upper class, that's great, I suppose. If your dad was a lawyer and now you're a lawyer. But that isn't really what it applies to. It really doesn't apply to the elite and the upper classes. They still have freedom. They have money. They have resources. They have education. They have opportunities. It really applies to the majority of what today we would use the term, in our society, wage laborers. All the people who worked for a living, for a wage, for a boss, or a lord, or whoever they worked for. Imagine, whatever job you had at age 16, flipping burgers, working at a car wash, delivering newspapers. I guess that's my generation, where you might have done that kind of thing. That's what you have to do the whole rest of your life. You can never do anything else. You can't go to college. You can't improve yourself. You can't ever work up the social ladder. Whatever job you had when you were young, that's the job you'll have when you're 60. And your kids and your grandkids will have to do the same thing. Pretty tough. We especially were like urban peoples. Urban peoples were certainly hit hard by this. There were a lot of municipal officials, like government officials. They're known as curiales. These lower level government officials, like your local civic officials, like at city and like community government, stuff like that. They actually had to spend all their own money to fulfill any shortfalls of like taxes. Say we have a tax bill of $100,000 and we only raise $80,000 from property taxes. Well, the curial then has to pay the other $20,000 out of his own pocket. He has to pay for any shortfalls, which often happen. Again, this is a terrible time. There's depression and there's inflation, and it's a rough time period. So being shortfall was all the time, which meant if you were a government official, you were almost always going bankrupt, losing your home, losing your land, everything. It even got to the point, get this, it even got to the point that they start choosing criminals as a sentence for a crime to be a curial. Think about that. It became so bad to be a government official in Rome, in some parts of Rome, especially the provinces, that you were actually sentenced as punishment for crimes to be a government official. Crazy, pretty crazy. More and more elite people wanted nothing to do with government. It used to be where government was all elites. Now the elite people want nothing to do with government. They don't want to have those jobs because they're going to go bankrupt. They're going to lose everything. People loved public service because they connected them to the emperor. That's not the case anymore. Hell, the emperor is probably lives somewhere far away. The emperors aren't even in Rome anymore. Even before Ravenna, we see emperors commonly not in the city of Rome. It was simply too chaotic. The city was. People would maybe do bribery or go to the army, stuff like that. Many simply ran away. They simply got away from the job and ran to some other place or some other province or some other city. This really leads to a total corrosion of government practices and standards and any type of what we think of as authority in government. All of the people who should be actually running government, the upper class, the educated, the elite, the people who have knowledge and experience, want nothing to do with government anymore. They want to go off, and this is what happens to most of them. They go off, and they have these big farm estates, and they become lords over some estate out in the country, out in some rural area, out in the provinces. This is where it really begins the feudal system of lords and knights and nobles with their castle and their little kingdoms out all across the countryside. The cities actually start to be emptied out. Now, it isn't like it's a dramatic overnight thing, but the population of Rome at the beginning of the empire, the city itself was probably close to 1 million. By the end of the empire, the population of Rome is thought to maybe be 250 to 400,000. People didn't want to be in the cities anymore. They started leaving the cities because no longer is it great to be in the cities. Cities are now full of warfare and strife and violence and depression and inflation and high prices and poor wages. The wealthy people are leaving. The cities are being run terribly because literally criminals are running the cities. Literally, criminals are running cities. So, yeah. There is no one reason why the Roman Empire falls. There's literally dozens of reasons. This is some of that. This is certainly part of that. Alright. From the Great Persecution to religious freedom. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. All right, many people believe that Rome's problems were caused by the gods' anger at the Christians. They believe that the Christians still, even by the 2nd, 3rd century, the Christians are being blamed for so many of Rome's problems. They still believe Christians rejected pagan gods, which they did, and they believe that the rejection of the pagan gods, the Rome's gods, which had been their traditional gods now for 1,000 years, is one of the reasons for the fall of Rome and why Rome is doing so badly. Diocletian launches a massive attack against Christians, which is known as the Great Persecution in 303, believing he is going to eliminate the Christians, restrict their powers, as a way to improve Rome's opportunities and Rome's chances. He seized their properties. He removes them from government positions. He kicks them out of office. He takes their land. He takes their businesses. He takes their money. He tears down Christian churches. He executes them. It's a massive attack on Christians, which ultimately backfires. Now, during the persecution, it's bad to be a Christian. Don't get me wrong, a lot of Christians were still okay with being martyred, thinking they were really doing the work of God and the work of Christianity. But generally, during the persecution, it might have been good to be a Christian if you wanted to live. But this actually ends up backfiring. There's a lot of sympathy generated for Christians, because Christianity now has been around for centuries. If you figure a generation is 20 years, Christianity has now been around for, 15 generations? It is part and parcel of Rome. Everyone knows Christians. Sees Christians. There's Christian churches around. Christianity is part of Rome now. Not the official religion, but it's still part of Rome. Anyway. So this real execution of martyrs, this execution and persecution of Christians, it does sort of backfire. It does. This fear of this concern over Christians, this persists for years, especially in the East. In the Eastern Roman Empire, it's actually maybe a little worse. But not only did it fail to eradicate Christianity, which is really so entrenched now that I don't know if that would even been possible. Not only did it fail to do that, it actually got so many people sympathetic for this mass execution of Christians that we start to see feelings about Christianity change. No longer was it seen just as, it's really weird how it happened. No longer is it seen just as coinciding side by side with paganism. Some people actually start to see and associate the violence and the killing of Christians with the violence in the Roman Empire. They start to pair them up together. And they start to see that all this bad things happen to Christians is all the bad things that isn't happening to Rome, but that Romans are actually doing to each other. The civil wars, the armies fighting each other, the emperors literally killing each other off. And some people actually start to look at it differently and say, well, you know what? Maybe if we weren't being so bad about the Christians, maybe Rome wouldn't be so bad. And some attitudes really start to shift. About this. Well, Constantine comes over. Constantine becomes the emperor. When he does this, he almost immediately. Okay, I'm gonna back that up. I don't have the exact year. He converts to Christianity. He actually feels such sympathy and believes that Christianity might actually be the answer to Rome's problems. Because what had Rome been doing for 3 centuries? Persecuting Christians. And during that entire time period, Rome had been on a steady decline. Not the whole time period. At least the last 100 years. And so in his view, he actually starts to look at it differently and say, you know what? Maybe the problem we've got is we should stop persecuting Christians and actually embrace Christianity. Maybe that is the solution. Maybe that is the answer. This new faith. Maybe. Now, he does, as often happens when people have these conversions, that, he's got a sign from God. He spoke to an angel. I think it amounted to somewhere, he had this vision or dream where if he converted, that God would help him in some coming battle, or God would assist in some way to make him more successful or more powerful. There you go. And he converts. He then wins this battle of Milvian Bridge. He then goes out to publicly declare himself a Christian. He didn't make it the official religion. That doesn't happen until, I think, Theodosius, maybe. We'll see in a minute. But yeah, he doesn't make it the official religion. That happens in, I don't think, a few more years, like closer to like 380 or something. He does, though, declare in what's known as the Edict of Milan, Italy, that Christianity is now to be accepted as a faith in, it's to be accepted as a faith in the empire. It is now an official faith of the empire. I don't believe that ever happened before. I believe this is the first time when Christianity is officially accepted, or it's actually written into the law that is now an official religion of the empire. He returns Christian property. He even gives back their property, their land. He gives them back jobs. He then compensates people who he took land from and gave to the Christians in an attempt to make peace between the polytheists, those that believe in many gods, the pagans, and the monotheist Christians. He then goes further. Oh, see, I hate they don't have it on the slide. It's too bad. But anyway, I've got a couple more things to say about that. He then goes further and recognizes the Lord's Day as a holy occasion, and he makes this Lord's Day a legal holiday, and he calls it Sunday. Now, why? Why is it called Sunday? Today, for Christianity, Sunday is typically the holy day of the week for most, I guess, all Christians. Most Christians is Sunday. I guess I need to clarify that. When I'm thinking like this, I'm thinking Protestant Christianity at Sunday. I can't speak for Catholic Christianity. I'm not that familiar with that. The holy day had been Saturday. Now, it had been Saturday because that was the Jewish Sabbath. The Jewish holy day was Saturday. So the Christians had been using Saturday as their holy day for 300 years because the Christians came from Judaism. This is when it actually gets converted to the next day, Sunday, under Constantine. Because Sunday was the holy day that was worshipped by the polytheists, the pagans, worshipping the sun god, worshipping the Roman god of the sun. So that's why it's called Sunday, the day of worshipping that. And because that was the most holy day of the week for the Romans worshipping the sun god, he now makes it also the holy day of the week for the Christians. So the Christians end up moving from Saturday to Sunday as a result of what Constantine does. So he's now a Christian. He does continue to hold the traditional title of the high priest, the Pontifex Maximus. He does consider himself the chief priest, but not of Christianity. So even though he's a Christian, he still is the chief priest of paganism as well. So he officially is a Christian, but he's also the head of the pagan church. That's an interesting line to walk, to basically be one faith, but be the leader of a different faith. I guess what it amounts to is looking at it this way. Personal belief, he was a Christian, but as his job, he was the head of the Roman church. Not necessarily Catholic, we're talking about the Roman pagan church, the polytheistic Roman Empire church. Zeus and I don't know. I get him confused. Is Zeus, is that like the Greek? And then I forget which is which, Roman and Greek. They're the same gods, just different names. Anyway, so it's really an interesting thing that happened under Constantine. He's the one that really shifts everything. Even though he doesn't make it the official religion, that doesn't happen for another, 70 years or something. What he does is makes Christianity officially normative in the Roman Empire. It is now perfectly normal to be a Christian, to participate in government, participate in politics, to be in the Senate, which I think the Senate still exists, to basically be part of Roman society as a Christian. You don't have to hide or worry about persecution anymore. I'm sure it isn't perfect, but it certainly is interesting. This is a portrait, not sure what that was, but a portrait of Constantine. He had these coins to proclaim his conversion to Christianity, of course also his power. It was proclaiming his power and authority. You can see the horse. You can see jewels all around him. You can see his armor on here. This indicates armor and horse indicates victory in warfare. And of course, the jewels and the crown indicating victory or indicating power as authority. So he's both the commander of the military and the commander of the government. You can also see the scepter with the cross over here, indicating his authority over Christianity. You can see the symbol on his head, which is a symbol of Christians on his head as well. This symbol, this Chi-Rho symbol on his head, I'm gonna go with, I think it's this symbol right here. These symbols, this Chi-Rho symbols. That is a symbol. It's Greek. It's a symbols that was indicating fish or fishermen, which was sort of how they would secretly acknowledge. It was like a secret sign to where Christians, because Christians often had to hide themselves because of persecution, they had this secret sign that indicated fish. as he was, which is this Chiro symbol. Interesting stuff. How Christians would secretly communicate with each other. And this Chiro sign on his head there, probably a lot of regular people may not have even recognized that, may not even know what it meant. And yet it was a sign to Christians that he's now a Christian. Interesting stuff. All right. Official Christianization of the empire from 312 to 540. Polytheism and Christianity in competition. So again, polytheism, that's paganism. That is many gods. Many gods, that is typical pagan worship of the Romans. And then, of course, Christianity, which is monotheism. Monotheism. All right. Polytheists and Christians did share some beliefs. Their holidays were typically the same. They had similar views on spring holidays, winter holidays. Pretty much all Christian holidays were simply Roman holidays that they converted over to Christian holidays for convenience. The Romans already celebrated those days, so they simply turned them into Christian holidays once Rome converts to Christianity. But there was no quick and easy transition to everybody becoming Christian. To try and convert over the entire empire, it's a process, a very slow process, actually. Polytheists and Christians often debated about whether there was one God or many gods, Christians believing one, pagans believing in many. Also, what the gods did, and further, what interest the gods had in our world. Like, what interest did gods have in you and me? Some polytheists, if you really look at paganism, traditionally the gods didn't take that much of a direct interest. The gods lived sort of their own lives. They had their own personalities, their own needs. They were humans. They were gods in human form. Well, the Christian God is supposedly takes a much more direct role. Is really much more invested in humans and what humans do in our world here on Earth, because his own son died here on Earth, so he takes a much more direct role. It seems pagan gods are more aloft, more away. Really, it's almost as I said before. Religion in Rome was almost a branch of the government. It was almost a business, a part of the government and a government business. Christianity is much different. Christianity is much more personal belief. The emperor, Julian the Apostate, who ruled for a very short time, just a couple years there, he tried to restore the traditional gods, tried to get rid of Christianity completely. He had his own set of polytheism, and he wanted to be the head of this new pagan, it's not new, but this renewed pagan church of Rome. Couple years. Didn't work out so well. He was removed from power pretty quickly. Subsequent Christian emperors began to slowly remove all polytheism privileges, titles, all practices, all rituals. From the 60s to the next 20, 30 years, we see paganism starting to be phased out of all official parts of society. The government, the church, rituals, festivals, everything, sacrifices, everything. As a result of what Julian did, further emperors believed that it must be necessary to get rid of all of it. So eventually Christianity was made the state religion. We see this decline of polytheism. It's eventually made the state religion by Theodosius. He ruled from 79 to 95. He banned sacrifices. He denied all government positions to any polytheists. He ordered all temples closed. In essence, Theodosius shut down the pagan, polytheistic Roman religion. After about, to continue that, after about, over 1,200 years. Over 1,200 years of Roman religion, he pretty much ended it. And Christianity. Christianity now becomes the religion of Rome. Official religion in 391. Temples are closed. Temples were converted over to Christian churches. Now again, Plato's Academy, interesting. That remained open. That was a non-Christian school. That was something that was more philosophy, not necessarily any type of paganism. Previous emperors had allowed Jews to actually practice their religion, but here's the interesting thing. Now that Christians are in power, now that Christianity is the official authority, it becomes more challenging to be a Jew. Judaism had often been accepted in Rome because it had been part of the Roman Empire now for centuries. For centuries, there had been Jews in the Roman Empire. It had become accepted. It had become standard, I suppose. Christians actually become a lot more restrictive. Lots of restrictions on Jewish temples and Jewish practice. Jews were banned from holding government jobs. By the 6th century, Jews were barred from marrying Christians. Jews couldn't make wills. Jews couldn't have inheritances. Jews couldn't testify in court. Incredible restrictions against Jewish peoples by Christians. Christians viewed all other religions as inferior and should not. This is what the Christian leaders, anyway, Christian emperors and Christian leaders of Roman Church, of Roman Empire, Eastern and Western, really considered Judaism. They didn't ban it completely, like they banned polytheism and paganism completely and started actually persecuting them, murdering them. They didn't go that far with Jews, but short of actually banning Judaism completely, they made it so restrictive to where Jews had no power, no authority, no positions, nothing, as a result of this Christian authority over the Roman Empire now. It's really interesting. Had they been able to, they might have completely tried to eliminate Judaism. They were not able to do that. So it isn't that this is a particular attack on Jews. This was an attack of the Christians upon any other faith. Polytheism, they eliminated completely. There's other religious faiths that'll pop up, either different versions of Christianity, that they'll persecute and eliminate completely. In a way, Judaism is actually lucky. They are allowed to continue to exist in an empire which has zero tolerance for any other religious belief other than Christianity. It's actually more restrictive and more oppressive than the original Roman polytheistic paganism was, which actually, due to the nature of paganism, the fact that there were a bunch of different gods, they were actually oftentimes more accepting of alternative religious beliefs, as long as it didn't directly challenge paganism, Roman polytheism. Christians were actually less tolerant than the Roman original religion was. Really interesting. Judaism does continue to survive, and we do see a lot of important religious scholarship come out of it. And the Jewish faith continues, and it does thrive in some places, especially on the fringes. The further you get from the heart of the empire, Judaism is able to have a little more success. It probably wasn't good to be a Jew in the heart of the Roman Empire. It would have probably been very restrictive, and there were even Jews that were executed for continuing to practice their faith where they were told they couldn't. Extent of Christianity by 300 CE here is the dark orange. By 300 to 600, it extends to the entire empire. So over 300 years, it goes from where it's about 15% of the empire to a couple hundred years later, the entire empire is Christian. And it even extends outside of the empire. By this point in time, by the 600s, a lot of these outer areas are not actually part of the empire. They're places that have fallen out of the empire. And yet Christianity has thrived and expanded and grown. It's actually really slow. We see other world religions which expand faster. Buddhism expands faster than Christianity. Later, soon we'll talk about Islam. Islam expands much, much faster. It's a slow-moving fire, if you will, Christianity. It managed to survive and thrive underground in small pockets and communities long enough to eventually, after almost 400 years, to actually overtake the entire empire. Very slow process. Christianity's growing appeal. The new status of Christianity certainly attracted new followers. Christian soldiers no longer faced a conflict between serving Christ while simultaneously serving a polytheist emperor and government. That's a good example. Now that everybody was on the same page, by 400, Christianity is the law of the land now. Many people found Christianity's strong sense of community and its emphasis on charity very appealing. The emphasis on salvation, afterlife, many people, a better afterlife, people found appealing. Women were excluded from church's authority, from church hierarchy and authority, but women could still gain status in the Christian church. They could give their property to the church. They could renounce marriage to dedicate their lives to Christianity, as a nun, as a sister. And the church did recognize women's contributions to Christianity. We even will eventually see women who are sainted. But positions of authority in the church, as far as in the official hierarchy, women are pretty much excluded from any type of official authority or making any type of rules, laws, any type of official policies, etc. Even though, again, they are recognized for their contributions to the church. This establishment of Christianity in Roman Empire largely depended on its success. It depended on it being successful in constructing sort of this formal leadership. The formal leadership was of male bishops. Male bishops had the authority, the leadership, and the power of the church. This church hierarchy, as we call it. Bishops are the one who could ordain priests, because there were actually many different ranks. They could ordain priests, lower level ranks of church clergy. They controlled the finances of the church, which were quite extensive even by this time period. And they actually came, in many cases, in many local regions and parts of Rome by the 400s. Who actually runs many of these regions and provinces are actually Christian bishops. The bishops eventually come to replace the curials. So we find many bishops simultaneously serving dual roles. The role of leader of the church, leader of the congregation in their own community and region, while simultaneously being a leader of the government. So we will sometimes have bishops that are both governors and the leader of their local congregation or regional church. And other government positions, not just governors, other government positions. This actually starts to become a pretty common practice, to where officers of the church serve dual roles both in the church, the sacred, and in the government, the secular. Secular being non-religious. This actually comes to be both a common practice in the church and also a controversy. Many people do object to it, even though it does start to become common in many places. Another thing about this is the bishops did claim apostolic succession. I think I talked about that before. All bishops claim to be descended from Peter. This is sometimes known as the Petrine doctrine. The idea that the very first bishop was the leader of the Christian church in Rome itself. Peter, he was an apostle of Jesus. Jesus gave him special authority, and in effect, this meant the first leader of the church after the death of Jesus was Peter. And therefore, the seat and the most significant power base of the Christian church was Peter's congregation, if you will, in Rome itself. And so Rome becomes the effective center of the Christian church, and therefore the bishop of Rome, since Rome is the center of the religion, the bishop of Rome becomes the highest ranked of all bishops, and that is the Pope, which means father. And so this Petrine doctrine and apostolic succession is what leads to the leader of the Catholic Church eventually becoming, very clearly, the Pope, the father of the church, which is the Bishop of Rome. Apostle Peter, the Pope right there. All right, the struggle for clarification in Christian belief. There were many different versions of Christianity, many sects, we would say. There were a variety of sects of Christianity. And lots of debate, lots of controversy over the reason for this. This is generally what we consider orthodox and heresy. Orthodox being the established traditional view of the church, the mainstream, if you will, and then heresy being the outlying groups. Sometimes small congregations would go their own direction and start changing the rules. Sometimes bishops would actually declare independence from the church and establish their own individual versions of Christianity, their own sects of Christianity. Now, as the church got bigger and bigger and became more established in the 400s, which is the 5th century, the hierarchy of the church, the bishops wanted to establish this doctrine, a uniform doctrine of Christian theology, Christian thought. But they also wanted to maintain authority. They wanted to maintain purity of Christianity. They wanted Christianity to be pure and to follow the traditional view of Christianity. I say that because it's a little ironic, because the interpretation of Christianity has changed multiple times over the centuries. So this idea of orthodoxy, ironically enough, in and of itself has actually changed and evolved. And so orthodoxy has meant different things in different centuries. 3rd century it means something, the 10th century it means something else, and by modern times the Christian orthodoxy has changed. It's constantly evolving. Christians disagreed about what constituted orthodoxy, the official doctrine, and any type of heresy. Heresy is simply, at its most simple, any type of religious belief that differs from the standard traditional belief, the mainstream belief, as dictated pretty much out of Rome, out of the city of Rome. One of the most significant dissenters, one of the most significant people who differed, or I guess would have been considered a heretic, differed from this doctrine, this orthodox doctrine, was Arius of Alexandria. Alexandria, this would have been in Egypt. This is in the, let's see, he lived 260 to about 336. So this would have been the 3rd, 4th century, 260 to 336. He actually proclaimed that Jesus was not the same of God. Jesus was not of God. He actually proclaimed that in some ways Jesus was a separate entity. Jesus was a separate religious entity than God. This would seem to indicate polytheism, that Jesus was not of God, so that there were really two deities. There's also another view of this, that Arius, some interpretation, take Arius was simply saying Jesus was a man. And therefore Jesus was taken by God after his death. This challenges the idea whether Jesus was eternal or not. Traditional Christian Orthodox, according to the Catholic Church, says that Jesus was eternal. Jesus was of God. Therefore, Jesus had always existed. Literally, since the beginning of time, Jesus had existed. And for the short period of time, he took human form, came down to earth, but he had always existed. He was eternal, the same as God had always existed. God was there at the beginning, will be there at the end. Jesus was the same. Arius differed in that. Arius said, this idea of Arianism, which is what we call as Arianism, just takes Jesus as not necessarily of God, not necessarily eternal, maybe even having actually been a real man, and then is then elevated to godhood. This is interesting because this sort of ties into some versions of polytheism. There was a common practice among polytheists, this is mythology, to where there would be half human, half gods that would do incredible feats, and then they would be elevated to full god status, if you will, almost like they were promoted. And Arian sort of is pushing this idea that Jesus might have been a man, was then elevated to full god status at some point. All right. Now, Arianism was popular among many. It actually got quite a few followers. Arianism, I think, technically still exists today. It's a really small group, but I think Arianism is actually still I think it exists. Don't get confused. This has nothing to do with Aryan, like white supremacy, white stuff like that. It's a totally different thing. It has nothing to do with this whatsoever. It actually made it simple. The idea of Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit being all different things, and how they were different. Because sometimes people were confused because the Holy Trinity, the idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that's three things. But yet Christian orthodoxy says they're really one thing. They're three in one. It's like a package deal. It's three in one. Arianism really says they're three separate things. They're really different things. If you're confused by it, don't worry about it. It's okay. It is confusing. Just take it as I said. Arianism says they're three separate things. Christian theology really says that they are, Orthodoxy says they're three things, but they're all one thing. They're all of the same essence. Okay. Now, Constantine chooses to address this. He actually convenes this huge meeting into 325, pulling hundreds of bishops, about 220 different bishops from all across the Roman Empire, even outside the empire, and they come to Nicaea, and they have this meeting, they have this big debate, and they come to debate Arianism to determine whether or not Arianism is valid or not. The council votes to abolish Arianism and to actually exile Arius. And I think Arius was a bishop, I think Arius was a bishop. And they choose to exile him, and they declare what we call the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed says, in essence, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, even though they are three separate, they are the same essence. It would almost be like if you had a glass of water and you divide it into three different glasses of water. They're all still the same water. They all came out of the same glass. They're all still the same essence. Even though you have three parts, they're 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, if you will. They're all the same thing. Anyway, this Nicene Creed is hugely significant because this becomes the standard orthodoxy of the church. There are three parts, but there are three parts of a whole. They're all eternal. They're all of God. And they're all eternal. They've always existed. They always will exist. They're of one substance. This substance of God, I guess. There's been lots of other disputes. There's disputes, lots of other disputes about Jesus and about God, and there's other things. I'm not going to get into others. This is a hugely significant one of the most significant ones. But bear in mind that there were other beliefs, and it did often divide the Christian church, and there were other groups that came along. This, though, establishes the orthodox view of Christianity. All right, the struggle for Christian clarification continued. We have three other groups: Monophysites, Nestorians, Donatites. I'm not so sure that's right, but I like it. It sounds good. Donatism, which is another one of these sects, another one of these beliefs. Monophysites, they were single nature believers, single being mono. They believed that the divine took precedence over human in Jesus, and that there was only one single nature. There was not three in one, there was just one. It always was just one, there always was. They split from Christian orthodoxy in the 6th century, and they developed their own churches. They established their own churches in Egypt, Ethiopia, Syria, Armenia. They go off their own directions and establish their own beliefs. Nestorius was a bishop. He was a bishop of Constantinople. He believed that Jesus had been born human and given divine nature later as well. Nestorian bishops in the Eastern Empire, they also found a separate church. This Nestorian church is established in Persia. We call this Nestorianism. Donatism begins in Africa with a priest named Donatus. Again, many different beliefs. Some still exist today. So most of these can still be found today. They still exist. They still, there are still small groups of people that worship these different Christian under Catholic Church, they would have all been considered heretics. Very interesting. 451, we have the Council of Chalcedon. This tried to establish this uniform orthodoxy. It failed. It established some rules. It established some rules. The significance of it is not that there was any real result, but that they continued year after year after year, decade after decade, century after century, to try and establish a uniform Christian theology. Because there had never been one established. The Christian church was really put together very haphazardly over the first 200 years. Combined with the fact that nothing was written down during Jesus' time. And combined with the fact that most of Jesus' followers were attacked, persecuted, executed. Combine that with the fact that Christianity itself was persecuted and kept underground, and much of it was they couldn't write things down. For the first couple of centuries, Christianity was this religion that sort of survived on the fringes, barely surviving in some cases. So by the time Christianity really establishes itself in the 300s, it had been around for so long of time that, I guess I'll say it differently. They had to firmly establish what it meant to be Christian. They had been around for 3 centuries, but due to all of the issues I just mentioned, they had never really firmly established what it meant to be Christian. It was still unclear. There's a reason that by the 400s, there were about 8 different sects, well-known, established sects of Christianity. 8 different ones, all with different views about policies and scripture and rules. It had been around so long and had been kept underground for so long, it had never really had the ability to develop really concrete structures and rules and guidelines and policies and to be followed. And so in the 400s, they have to start doing that. They almost have to rebuild the entire religion from scratch, almost starting over. Now, they might not have seen it that way, but that's really what they did. They had to rewrite all the rules, rewrite all the scriptures, they retranslated everything, and they sort of had to start over and rebuild the entire religion from scratch, taking all the puzzle pieces and trying to put them together into a new form. Council of Chalcedon, Council of Nicaea, these are all different ways to try and establish what had never really been established, what Christianity really was. They sort of built this new religious faith, but yet it does, in many ways, mirror and hold faithful to the beliefs they had been following for centuries. That just had never really been official. Really interesting. Augustine from 354 to 430, it was his lifetime. He was a bishop of Hippo in North Africa. He became probably the most influential thinker in establishing church orthodoxy. His writings supported secular law and social institutions, believing that secular had to exist right alongside sacred. You had to have secular law, secular institutions, secular kings, secular even emperors, right alongside Christian rulership. He believed that Christianity was a support. It was very important, but it was a big support to actual secular rulership. They had to both exist. They had to both survive at the same time. Moral corruption was a problem, that there was an imperfect world of humans, and while Christianity would be responsible for the souls, someone else had to be responsible for the physical safety of the people in the empire. That's the Roman government. That's the emperor. That's the soldiers. So, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. You have to have security, laws. You have to have governance. And you simultaneously have to have religion and faith for the soul. Very interesting. He was also an ascetic. An ascetic is someone who gives up all worldly things. They give up any type of luxuries. Oh my God, some ascetics even went so far as to give up their clothes. I'm not saying Augustine went that far, but asceticism really was about this idea to where you have to deny yourself pleasure. Passions are bad. Human passions are bad because human passions often lead to sin. Bottom line there. Human passion is bad, so you need to be dispassionate, except perhaps about God, but nothing else among humans. So in other words, passionate up to the heavens, but among humans, passion should not exist, really. No pleasure, no sexual desire. He really preached abstinence for clergy. For clergy, virginity and renunciating all sex. For clergy. Even in marriage, sexual renunciation. He was able to do this very clearly because he said there was two parts to the world. There was a secular and a sacred. The sacred part of the world should give up any type of pleasure, no sex, no procreation, no reproduction. But that is because we can live side by side with the secular world, the non-religious world, and that part of the world, they're going to have all kinds of sex and have babies all they want. That's them. It is the clergy, the people who are really devoted to, in essence, married to God, those folks. Yeah. So by the 4th century, celibacy becomes a standard practice in the church. No sex for men or for women. Very interesting. This is Jesus as sun god. Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus. The Roman god of the sun was this Sol Invictus. So this is why we call it Sunday. Again, the holiday was changed to the holiday for the sun god, Sunday. And they started worshiping Christianity on that day when Christianity becomes the faith of the church, faith of the empire, sorry. Nothing to do with the Son of God. It's Sunday because of the sun god of the Romans. He has a halo, beams of light around his head. Really interesting imagery. He leads a chariot and horses. This is indication that Sol Invictus looks like an emperor coming back from conquering an enemy. Very apparent blending here of paganism and Christianity. It's really got to be understood how much Christianity is really just, how much Christianity, put it this way, anywhere possible, Christianity simply used paganist beliefs for their own and simply morphed them or altered them into their own beliefs. This idea of the halo around the heads, like today, if you look at any type of Christian imagery, you always see the circle around the head. That indicates a halo. That indicates the power of God. That comes from this. It comes from Sol Invictus. It comes from the idea of the sun god and the rays of light radiating from his head. We worship Christianity on Sunday because that was the god there. Christmas was a pagan holiday. Easter was a pagan holiday. Most Christian holidays. Christianity developed in a polytheistic world, and it had to take polytheism and morph it into monotheism. And so many practices of Christianity can be directly traced back to polytheism, the paganism, that they simply took it and renamed it, which was what Rome did. Remember what Rome did that in the first place. All the Roman gods were Greek gods. They simply took all the Greek gods and renamed them and reformed them into Roman gods. And so the Roman leadership, when Christianity became the leading religion in Rome, they simply did the same thing. They took the polytheistic religion and morphed it into a monotheistic religion. It's not surprising. Not surprising at all. All right, what are we looking here? Non-Roman kingdoms in the Western Empire, 370 to 550. This is the barbarian invasions, for way of putting it. The Germanic tribes moving into the Northern Roman Empire. 4th century emperors, they originally encouraged this immigration. Originally encouraged immigration of non-Roman peoples into the Roman Empire. They typically recruited them and used them as border security, border guards. We talked about that before. Take your enemy and use them against other enemies. Now, by the later 4th century, floods of these non-Roman immigrants into the empire, men, women, children, entire tribes became common, coming into the Roman territories, Roman provinces to settle in there. These groups of these non-Roman peoples, who were typically referred to as barbarians, they had very strong motivations. They were fleeing other tribes. The Huns, for instance, was one of the many tribes. Fleeing them while simultaneously wanting to be part of the Roman Empire, which was wealthy and rich and good prosperity in the Roman Empire. Potentially prosperity. All right. These individual clans were based on kinship. Typically, they were family clans. Long extended families, large extended families, these clans. They were grouped into these loose, multi-ethnic coalitions, often called tribes, which were pretty much open to anybody. As long as you were willing to follow the rules and accept whoever the lord was over the tribe, they had an open door policy. They would, as they would travel and migrate over large geographic areas, they would incorporate new people into the tribe, and the tribe would grow and expand and adapt to the territory. Typically, you would have assemblies of free male warriors. They would govern the tribe, usually with a warlord or a chief. These were sort of like a council of elite warriors, the upper level warriors. They were prone to conflicts, internal feuds, warfare, civil war amongst themselves. They were a warrior people. They valued strength over anything else. These mass migrations really began in earnest, in large migrations, probably in the 5th century under Attila the Hun. Many people have heard of Attila. And so Attila was a very aggressive warlord in Eastern Europe and pushed many of these tribes into the Roman Empire, trying to flee his aggression. One of these groups is the Visigoths. The Visigoths is one of these barbarian tribes fleeing the Huns and coming in contact with the Roman Empire. They were running from the Huns. They requested asylum in the Eastern Roman Empire from the Eastern Emperor, and the agreement was struck. If the Eastern Roman Emperor allowed the Visigoths into the Roman borders, the Visigoths would therefore in turn have to enlist and become part of the Roman military, and they would have to protect the borders after they came into the Roman Empire. They would be able to enjoy the prosperity of Rome while simultaneously guarding its borders from other tribes, other groups, even the Huns, whoever. All right. Over time, these Visigoths are mistreated, as most tribes were. They're not unusual. There's lots of other tribes, but they were mistreated. They eventually rebel, and they even fight back against the Roman Empire. They, ironically enough, brought in to protect, often leads to war, violence, civil war. This kind of thing often happened. Now, after the death of Emperor Theodosius, remember Theodosius made Christianity the official religion in the 380s. After the death of Theodosius, he had actually allowed the Visigoths in. He had actually granted them permission to establish inside the empire. The Visigoths are given permission to form their own kingdom within the Roman Empire. Very interesting how to do this. All right. Now, other emperors, remember, by the 400s, we have 2 empires, really, even sometimes 4, depending on how it's broken up. Whether it's 2 emperors or 4 emperors. It's kind of a... It's kind of, I don't know, I don't know if chess game or puzzle is the way to put it, but like every new emperor that would come to power would change the rules. So here it's 1 emperor, the next generation it's 2, then it's 4, then it's 2, then it's 1, then it's 2. Yeah. With absolute power comes apparently absolute insanity, as the last 200 years of the Roman Empire are evidence of. Anyway, later emperors are very upset with this. They believe the Visigoths are establishing a kingdom within the Roman Empire. They don't agree with that. They threaten war. The Visigoths have gotten so powerful and have become so independent, basically as, in effect, allies of the Roman Empire, while living in the Roman Empire, as part of the Roman Empire. They enjoyed the prosperity of the Romans, used Roman weapons, Roman armor, Roman military tactics. So it's not surprising that the Visigoths actually were able to attack, invade into the city of Rome itself. And they burned down part of the city of Rome. It's called sacking. They sacked the city of Rome, doing untold amounts of damage and death and destruction in retaliation for other Roman emperors not living up to the bargain made under Theodosius. Really interesting. The weak Western government actually allows them to continue on and says, okay, fine. You can continue to stay here. Basically, they signed a truce with them. Realizing the Visigoths were too powerful to defeat, they agreed to let the Visigoths settle in the Western Roman Empire. And the Visigoths go into Gaul, which is, I guess, that would be modern-day France, and they settle there and expand into a kingdom in Gaul, and then expand into Spain. This is really the beginning of the end. Rome is now selling off entire territories to their enemies, so the enemies don't conquer Rome itself, the heart of the empire. I guess the logic was Roman emperors and Roman government thought they would just retract into an old size, maybe go back to what it was 1,000 years earlier, to where it was just Italy maybe, and they were just going to keep getting smaller and smaller, giving away chunks to their enemies to appease their enemies so the enemies didn't take everything. Hey, take this entire chunk of our empire and leave us the rest of it. Enjoy all that prosperity in what becomes Spain and France. Seems like it. All right. Concessions to the Visigoths, though, encourage others. So you have other tribes. I mean, there's lots of other tribes. There's Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Anglo-Saxons, there's the Celts, there's lots of other tribes. So, but the way the Romans basically caved in to the Visigoths and gave them all this territory and wealth, we see other tribes seeing this and hoping for the same thing. The Vandals are in northern Africa. They eventually break off and form their own kingdom in northern Africa, and the Anglo-Saxons are up in northern France and Britain, the island of Britain up there. And they eventually break off and form their own kingdoms as well. This happens over multiple decades, all through the 400s, until finally, towards the end of the 400s, we get the end. This is what we've been leading up to for, a couple chapters now. We finally get to the end. Odoacer, who was an Ostrogoth, I believe. He was one of the Goths. He was Austro or Visigoth, I think. I think he was an Ostrogoth. Anyway, Odoacer came in. He was actually given concessions by the Roman Empire. He was made into a general. He rises to power, decides he wants to be in power. He's not willing to be paid off or given concessions like the rest. After all, Rome was so weak by now, they couldn't stop him from doing whatever he wanted. Rome had an emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer marches his army into Rome, the city, I don't know where Romulus Augustulus was. He might have been in Ravenna, I don't know where he was. Nonetheless, he marches into the heart of the empire, declaring himself emperor, telling Romulus Augustulus, you're no longer emperor. Romulus Augustulus doesn't get executed or anything. He actually gets shipped off to some island, I think, to where he ends up living the life of royalty or whatever. This is when one of the Gothic kingdoms takes over the Roman Empire. This is it. This is the end. The year 476. 476 is, in essence, the end of the Roman Empire. Now, there still is some emperors. They're Goths, though. They're Gothic emperors, and some of them even claim that they're ruling the Roman Empire. It's really just a large kingdom now. It's sort of just a kingdom because all of Europe is now part of some other Gothic kingdom. All of Western Europe is Gothic. Northern Africa is in the hands of the Vandals. Egypt and Greece is now part of the Eastern Roman Empire, which has its own emperor. Really, there's almost nothing left but Italy and some surrounding lands a little bit there. Theodoric leads the Ostrogoths, who were also part of the Roman military. They're one of the ones that were brought in to be the Roman military. He takes over after Odoacer, and he starts ruling from the city of Ravenna. Theodoric was actually an Arian Christian. He was an Arian Christian. He left the Roman institutions intact and basically started ruling as Roman emperor, even though we don't really consider this the Roman Empire any longer. Not in Europe, anyway. It's really an Ostrogothic kingdom. He might have called himself a Roman emperor. He ruled as Roman emperor from Ravenna, which had been the capital of the Roman Empire now for well over a century. So he was pretending to be a Roman emperor, but really, he was really just a warlord over a small kingdom. Because the size of what Rome was now, in the Western world anyway, was about a tenth of what it had been. It wasn't really an empire any longer. Not really at all. Finally, another group that comes in, the Franks. This is in Central Europe. They move Roman Gaul, which was France. They turn it into what becomes known as Francia. Francia, with their king Clovis. Clovis is the king in the 400s to 500s. I think officially 485 to 511. He overthrows the Visigothic king. His new dynasty, known as the Merovingian dynasty. Again, this is all in your book. His new dynasty, the Merovingian dynasty, takes over. It rules for many years, I think the next century. And this, in essence, ushers in what we will call the Franks, and the rulership of the Franks, which rule really much of Central Europe for the next couple hundred years. So, yeah, the Germanic invading tribes invade so much that the Romans eventually let them in voluntarily. They come in, they start forming their own independent kingdoms. Some emperors allow it to happen, some fight it, no one can stop it, till eventually Rome is really a collection of barbarian kingdoms. Ostrogothic, Visigothic, the Vandals, Anglo-Saxons, the Celts, and others. Now, all this is happening in northern Africa and Europe. Eastern Roman Empire manages to maintain cohesion. Everything from Greece over and Egypt over, they manage to maintain that cohesion, and that maintains as an empire. They reinforce their borders, they retract, they have a much smaller empire. It's still pretty big, and they completely abandon. They completely abandon the Western Empire, pretty much. It's not 100%. Like, I think even Clovis, might have actually worked with one of the Roman emperors in Byzantium to try and overthrow the Visigoths. For the next couple centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire tries to take back parts of the Western Empire. And they get a piece here and a piece here. But they never even begin to maintain or to restore the power and glory of what it had been. Here we have the Franks over here, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths. There's other groups I didn't mention. There's the Lombards. You have the Lombards, the Visigoths, the Angles, the Saxons, the Huns, the Celts. Yeah. All of these are pretty much, just about all of these are pretty much European tribes. These European peoples. For centuries, they had been the outsiders outside of Rome, looking in. For centuries, they had been outside looking in at all the prosperity and power of Rome, and had been learning slowly with leaked technology, leaked knowledge over centuries and centuries. And they had been watching as the Roman Empire became more and more decadent, more and more corrupt, more and more bankrupt, and then over a 200-year period, 150 years really, constant invasions, constant attacks, constant concessions from the Roman emperors and Roman government eventually lead just to an all-out collapse of the empire, to where Roman Empire is really mostly governed by barbarian kings and kingdoms, Gothic kingdoms. Eastern Roman Empire holds on. But look how much smaller it is. This was all Rome. Basically, 70% of it is now gone. But this part survives. This part over here, Egypt, a little bit into Syria and the Middle East, and then this, which is Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, this region. This region here survives. It is still a very big region, and it still has a big chunk of the Mediterranean. And I think they even go so far as they still actually control parts of Greece too, I think. It's really interesting. All right, social and cultural transformation in the Western Roman Empire. Now that the Roman Empire is really under the authority of different Germanic tribes, things change a little bit. These non-Roman kingdoms, they often adopt Roman law codes, Roman rules, Roman policies. It was what was already in place. Plus, Roman law and order existed. Lots of established policies and norms to keep laws. There was a bureaucracy, government, tax system, court system, everything. So when possible, the Germanic tribes usually tried to maintain a semblance of Roman society. If for no other reason is simply, how to put it, if you're able to maintain cohesion, if you're able to maintain the way things had been, it's a sense of stability, a sense of norm. It makes it easier to rule people. The less you have to shake people's lives up, the easier they are to fall in line. In other words, if the new boss is the same as the old boss, and everything's really the same, the person is just a new name, many people will simply accept it and be okay with it, without shaking everything up and making everything crazy. All right. The Visigothic kings, they adopt a written code of law. They were the very first Goths to do this. Again, it's really copying Roman law. It was composed in Latin, and it was really unique. The Visigoths typically decided all disputes with war, fighting. They develop a new type of law we call the Weirgild. The Weirgild, Weirgeld, Gild. There's Wergeld. There's different ways to spell it. You can look up an official spelling. Your book probably has it. And what this amounts to is this. Instead of us having to fight to the death every time we have a disagreement, or try to kill each other, or rape each other's women, or steal each other's cows, if we have a disagreement, whoever is found to be the offending party simply has to pay a fine. Simple. It was a way to resolve disputes without having to chop each other's heads off. More civilized, if you will. The Frankish king Clovis, as I mentioned before. There it is, Wergild. Ha! It's in my notes. Did I get one of the spellings right? I think I got one of them right out of the 4 guesses I made. The Frankish king Clovis also wrote laws in Latin for the Merovingian kingdom. That's over in Western Europe. I said that. The Merovingian kingdom in Western Europe. His code of law promoted social order, very, very clear penalties for crimes, and this most common part of the system was the Wergild, where you'd make a payment for a crime, as opposed to killing each other, lopping each other's heads off. There was a further aspect to this, too. Sometimes these were blood crimes or blood punishments, which meant if you committed a crime against me, I might actually go after you, your wife, your kids, your whole family, until I felt vindicated, until I felt we were even. So I might actually kill multiple people in your family to make up for a crime you committed against me. This blood debt, blood oath, whatever you want to call it. The Wergild does away with that. No more slaughtering other people's families because they committed a crime. I'm sure it didn't work perfect, but the idea was you had to pay a fine or a penalty. That means generating wealth becomes very important now. Prosperity becomes very important because you need money to pay off your debts, to pay off your crimes. You need money to, basically, it's like It's like breaking the law and getting a fine, like getting a ticket or a citation today. You break the law, you got to pay the fine. That's really what the war guild amounts to. But really, the purpose of it was to stop so much random killing and slaughtering of different peoples. Under that, we have an actual law code that we should be following. Waves of migrations and frequent raiding continues. Eventually, economic activity shifts completely from cities to countryside because the cities are targets. The cities are constant targets. They think they have more wealth, they have more prosperity, you're likely to have richer people, treasures, etc. So we start to see much of Western Europe depopulate from rural to where most people start living in small communities, in countrysides, in more rural areas and farms. As I mentioned before, we see the population of Rome, for instance, which still is a large city. It's still maybe the largest city in Europe at this time, probably still, but we see the population of Rome decrease by 50%. Hundreds of thousands of people leaving the city, dying, or simply, dying in the city and no one replacing them. We also see birth rates decline, too, among the Roman populations. And there's a couple reasons for that, we think. I'm not going to get into it. But anyway, we see the majority population living in more of a rural lifestyle, which, of course, takes away from education, schooling, takes away from culture. Typically, the cities are the places that have the most education, the most culture, the most science, the most technology, philosophy, whatever. Anything you could associate with any type of improvement. Civilization itself is really centered around urban areas, going all the way back to Mesopotamia. The first civilization was really the urban areas. Well, Europe starts to revert and actually move back. And we do call this period, starting in the 500s, we do sometimes call this the Dark Ages. 500s, 600s, 700s, 800s, we are sometimes refer to this as the Dark Ages in Europe. As Europe sort of goes backwards. They don't go back to the Stone Age by any means, but they go back to sort of early Iron Age, to where life just seems to move back a ways, or to sort of stall out. While the rest of the world continues to advance, the Middle East, the Arab world, India, China, they continue to advance technologically. Don't get me wrong, they have their own problems too, but they continue to have big cities, they have schools, universities, all kinds of new technologies, new weapons technologies, they develop science, medicine, while Europe just sort of flatlines for several centuries. The Dark Ages in Europe. Really interesting. Really interesting stuff. Alright, let's see. Next page. Alright. I mentioned that. Preferring self-sufficiency and isolation, lots of Romans built these big estates, these big lords' estates out in the countryside. They were fortified. They were staffed with tenant farmers, basically farmers living on the land. We sometimes would call these serfs. They might not use the term yet, but it really is what it is. They're farmers, that they're not slaves, but they're stuck on the farm, on that land. Basically, they're owned by the Lord. They can't go somewhere else. They own nothing. They don't own the land. They don't own the food. They don't own their home. They don't own their tools. They don't own their horses. Hell, they probably didn't even own their clothes. So they can't go anywhere. Literally, if you wanted to leave one of these lords' estates, which some of them have hundreds, even thousands of people, you could be a roaming, homeless beggar. Those are your options. So the vast majority of people stay there forever. And this becomes the basis of the feudal system in Europe. The feudal system of lords and knights, each with their own little castle and their walls and their own little farming communities and a couple little local villages. This becomes pretty much the standard of European society for most people, outside of a few places like Paris and London. Outside of a few places, this becomes the standard in almost all of Europe. for, almost 1,000 years. Almost a millennia. Speaking of this feudal system of lords and lords' estates, and most people living a rural lifestyle, a small village and farm lifestyle, this becomes the dominant way of society in Europe for the better part of a millennia after the fall of the Roman Empire. They stopped the bridges, they stopped building the roads, no one's repairing the roads, no one's repairing the bridges, there's no postal system, there's no roving armies across the lands. It's just all of the advances that the Roman Empire had made for centuries, it's like time just moved on, or time moved back. As the vestiges of what the government had been goes away, we start to see these little local nobles, these local lords. They no longer contribute to the kingdoms. They no longer contribute taxes to any type of a central economy. And what we find is basically each of these little lords becomes a wealthy little mini kingdom on their own little estate and their own little local villages. They hoard all their wealth. They store it in their castles, and they store it in their vaults, whether it's wealth in the form of money or food or taxes they collect from their local population. It's quite interesting. It really is. It's quite interesting how it happens. That was the end and what Europe looked like after the end of the Roman Empire, pretty much by the 500s. It happens pretty fast, really. Once the empire had been crumbling for centuries, but it had maintained general cohesion. It's like an egg that's full of cracks, but the egg actually hasn't cracked yet. Once the cracking happened, it just fell apart in, 70 years? A human lifetime. Wealthy human. But in the period of one human lifetime, one old person, Rome went from cohesive, full of cracks, to non-existent. If you actually think about an empire which had lasted for almost 13 centuries, its ultimate collapse happened really fast. It really did. Relatively speaking, quote-unquote, overnight, practically. Well, our last section we'll talk about, the final thing we'll talk about, Eastern Roman Empire, the beginnings of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire. It survives for another 1,000 years in a few different forms. All right, so let's end with that and talk about that. Imperial society in the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. All right, historians refer to this empire after 600 as Byzantine Empire, because it is still the capital is Constantinople, because Constantine renamed it in the 300s. But the original name of the city had been Byzantium. Today it goes by a totally different name, too. I can't think of it off the top of my head. It has, it'll probably come to me in a minute. Anyway, so it had been Byzantium, so we call it the Byzantine Empire. By the earliest 6th century, this empire had achieved great authority, great wealth, status, all of the status, wealth, and power that the Roman Empire had. When it collapsed, pretty much transferred over to the Eastern Roman Empire, which was much smaller, more compact, much smaller borders. This was about 1/4 of the entire empire. Still a big territory. Still comprising today will be multiple states, or multiple countries, sorry. The states are countries, yeah. Lots of power and wealth and status. Trade routes, of course. We still have the Silk Roads going back and forth right through the Eastern Roman Empire. One of the major sources of revenue for anybody back then was trade. Big source of revenue. Trade routes ran right through the heart of the empire. Many of the trade routes went right through Constantinople itself. The markets kept growing and flourishing. We see all kinds of luxury goods imported from the east, gems and silks and spices. This, for several centuries, is a wealthy, powerful, maybe the most powerful empire in the world, let's say it differently, maybe the richest empire in the world for a couple centuries, mostly due to its location on the Silk Roads, pretty much all trade routes, because the empire was very long north to south. It actually, north to south, covered 3 continents: Europe, Asia, Africa. So pretty much all trade, not everything, but most trade that went east and west across Afro-Eurasia crossed some part of the Byzantine Empire's borders. And they, of course, got a piece of that action. So it made them very wealthy, being their location as pretty much the center of the world at the time, really. They spent lavish amounts of money on big construction projects, big religious festivals, public entertainment, chariot races. They had this massive complex, which was even bigger than the Colosseum in Constantinople, where you had these huge chariot races inside this huge, wow. I want to call it the Hippodrome. Don't quote me on that, if that's right or not. That sounds right, though. Anyway, they had these things, and they had big competitions. They were by colors, like the reds, the greens, the blues. They were different teams. Only it was so bad that when one team won and the other teams lost, sometimes people killed each other in the streets over it. Yeah, imagine, you go to a sports game, and you go to a football game, and, the team and whoever beats the other team. Imagine going to the parking lot afterwards and starting to kill each other over it. Beat each other to death in the parking lot because my team lost or your team won or whatever the hell. I mean, that kind of stuff happened. People were willing to kill over who won, whether the Reds or the Blues or the Greens. Yeah, these chariot races are a big deal. I'm sure people probably bet on it too, I would think. The Eastern emperors, some of the most famous, of course, Justinian and Theodora, who were, as far as in the early Byzantine Empire, they were probably the most famous emperor and empress, husband and wife, and they did rule jointly. Technically, he was the emperor. He had all the authority, but in reality, Theodora ruled right alongside him. And we think, historically speaking, she probably wielded just as much power as he did. Ironic when you consider she was a prostitute. He picked her up in a brothel and fell in love with her, married her, and made her the queen of the most wealthy empire in the world, probably. Quite interesting. Nonetheless, she was incredibly powerful, and Justinian went out and fought wars, which meant while he was gone, she ruled the entire empire. And apparently she did a really good job. She was a woman, and again, I don't believe there was ever a woman who ruled independently in the Roman Empire or the Byzantine ever over the 2,000 years. I don't think ever there was a woman who was officially the ruler. But in effect, while Justinian was off fighting wars, Theodora ruled the empire. She was an incredibly powerful figure. Now, these emperors considered themselves preservers of Roman traditions, and they really wanted to limit any type of influence from the barbarians. They believed the barbarians, the Huns and the Goths and all the others, were enemies. Hands down, the enemies. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire in Rome had no choice but to befriend the barbarians to try and keep them from conquering them. That goes bang, that survives for 100 years, and then the barbarians do it anyway. Well, the Eastern Roman Empire considers these barbarians, these Goths, these Huns, these Vandals, everybody, to be the enemy. So they wage wars against them. Justinian spends his entire life basically fighting and waging wars against the Goths, and I think he does some against the Syrians too in the east, because Syria was part of the Byzantine Empire. All right, they hated these barbarian, migrant, immigrant peoples. Now, they certainly believed in the idea of Romanists, the idea of we must preserve the Roman way of life, the Roman Empire. It was incredibly diverse, though. Multiple ethnicities, languages, and multiple religions. It's really interesting. Rome, once it became Christian, was not tolerant at all, really, for the next 100 years of any other religious belief. Eastern Roman Empire is different. Eastern Roman Empire was actually very tolerant. Christianity became the leading religion, but they had open door policy to all kinds of religious beliefs. We found evidence historically, archaeologically, if that's the right way to put it. There's evidence in multiple Byzantine cities of half a dozen different religious beliefs, different religious structures, all same time period. So it was actually, at least under Justinian and early on, very tolerant of other religious beliefs, even though it was Christian. Although it should be noted, this is a Christianity which does differ from Catholic Christianity. The Christianity in the Eastern Roman Empire would have probably been considered heretics by the Roman Catholic Christian faith. This was a different Christian faith that develops in the Eastern Roman Empire. It might have started out the same, but over time, the two Christianities diverge and become quite different. Even to the point where at one point they go to war with each other. Actually, more than one point, really. Getting ahead of myself there. They wanted to keep this Romanness. They wanted to maintain this idea that Eastern Roman Empire was still Roman. They called themselves Roman, by the way. We call them Eastern Roman Empire today, but the people in Byzantium didn't call themselves Byzantines like we do. They called themselves Romans. In every way, they believed they were the Roman Empire. That is why sometimes it is referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire. Even though it had been part of the Roman Empire, but it really differed dramatically. Women in this empire, they lived very much according to ancient traditions, Mediterranean traditions. They supported their households, had very minimal legal rights. They avoided contact with men. We find that in Eastern Roman Empire, it becomes very standard practice for women to be kept separate from men, to women having very limited public roles. In Rome, for instance, a well-off woman could have public roles. It could be involved in public religion. Women could run shops. In the Eastern Roman Empire, women are much more secluded, kept protected, and also, we would use the term today, oppressed. Much more so than in the Western Roman Empire. This has interesting ramifications for later times, how women are treated in the East. Because bear in mind, much of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, is what we refer to as the Middle East today, which is even today thought to have some of the most restrictive, oppressive measures about women. Well, much of what that is today was the Eastern Roman Empire, which had many restrictive, oppressive measures of women. It's interesting to note. Women of high status, those at court. When you say at court, that's referring to people associated with the emperor and the royal family and the capital city, people associated with the higher halls of government. And it might physically actually mean within the palace of the emperor. So if you were at court, you might have more opportunities because you might have education. You might be a part of a wealthy family. You might even be part of the royal family. You could achieve prominence here you couldn't achieve anywhere else. For instance, Theodora herself. She was a prostitute. She rose from literally what many would have considered the lowest status of a woman as a prostitute to becoming the highest status woman in the entire empire, even equal to the emperor himself. Wealth equated into status. It's always been that way, always will be that way. The wealthy, well, they can get away with shit none of the rest of us can. Always is that way, nonetheless. So here, wealth could also translate to women having opportunities they wouldn't have anywhere else. There's no public education for women, but you could get a private tutor, a private teacher. Again, if you're wealthy. To pay for a private instructor, expensive. Christianity as well. Let's see, Christianity had some effects. You couldn't really divorce as a woman, made it really almost impossible to divorce. Much more restrictive Roman women could get divorces on actually a whole slew of grounds if they wanted to. Not here. Remember, this is a society which treats women a lot differently than the Roman Empire had treated them. A lot more restrictive than it had been previously. You also were not supposed to remarry either. Very harsh penalties for sexual offenses against women. Women could be tortured, imprisoned for sexual infidelity. Very harsh penalties against women for any type of sexual misconduct. Penalties against the men, not really notable. Men could sleep around and do what they wanted. They put a really high focus here on family line and heredity. This became a major focus of the Byzantine Empire. Family name became of utmost importance. It's really weirdly ironic. Think about the way it had been in the Roman Empire in the beginning. Back when the patricians were the only ones that mattered, back when there were 150 families, you go back 1,000 years, so 150 families basically ruled everything, and you want to go back to like the 4 and 500s BCE. It's sort of like that here. It's all about family name and family status. This becomes a very elitist society, very divided, to where there's a group at the top which has all the status and wealth, total supreme authority, and then everyone else. You saw that in the Roman Empire as well, but it is even more defined here in the Byzantine Empire. This is Theodora. This is Theodora, her court. The court also could refer to the personal entourage, if you will, use a modern term, the personal entourage of the queen herself. So a court could be a physical place. It could be an idea of the association with the upper class and the royalty. It could actually be a personal assistance or personal, not even assistance, but just part of the royal government or ladies in waiting or stuff like this. So yeah, Theodora here, and then I also have an image of Justinian. I don't know if I have it here. I think we have Justinian. Oh yeah, you'll see that one in a minute. Justinian as well. It's an interesting image though. It's beautiful. It's a mosaic, I think. Is this a mosaic? Does it say on here? It doesn't say on the bottom. I'm not positive it is. Maybe a painting. It's on a wall. Yeah. See how she's dressed in the royal purple. Assistants here. In case you didn't notice this, she has a halo around her head. Under what eventually we ended up calling Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. This Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, she was considered as a saint. I don't know if she was ever officially sainted, but at least at this time, she may have been. At this time, she was considered as a saint, with the halo around her head. Assisted by women over here, men over here. Beautiful clothing, incredible detail, very gorgeous. It's really nice. It's a really pretty image. All right, the reign of Justinian, the emperor. All right, the reign of Emperor Justinian. Justinian became the most famous Eastern emperor. He waged war to reunite the empire, trying to bring back the way it had been. Even hoping to bring it back to the way it had been at the time of Augustus. Kind of crazy, really, but nonetheless. He made imperial rule more autocratic, to where it was entirely within his authority and his hands. He constructed costly buildings. He instituted all kinds of legal and religious reforms. In addition, he aimed to preserve social order based on a hierarchy and have divine goodwill. So, he tried to restructure the entire empire. He wanted to make the Eastern look like the Western, look like the way it had been. To make his total authority, the empire, he tried to rebuild the empire in his image. It might be a way to look at it. Justinian ruled from about 527 to 565, so almost 40 years, which is pretty impressive. He launched expeditions over several decades to reclaim much of the West, much of the old Roman Empire. Lots of effort, expense. He did eventually take over parts of Italy, parts of Spain, and parts of northern Africa, regaining maybe half of the old Roman Empire. For a while, the empire was reunited, temporary reunited for a while. But he continued at war almost his entire reign as emperor, was constant warfare. The constant warfare in the West really destroyed infrastructure in the West, destroyed much of the West, but also damaged the Eastern economy as well. The already overburdened empire was so taxed, so heavily taxed that the countryside became plagued by constant banditry. Many people poured into the cities looking for protection and relief. Yeah, we do see a much more urban empire. That's a good comparison to the Roman Empire in the West. Much more urbanized than what happens to the Western Roman Empire. Justinian's unpopular taxes eventually leads to riots, the Nika riots in 532, which left much of Constantinople in ruins. To make matters worse, in the 540s, this epidemic killed off maybe a third of the entire population of the empire. The entire empire. This plague, I don't know what plague it was, probably the Black Plague or something like that, but I mean, yeah. Crazy, really. Crazy that Justinian actually held it together, really, when you consider all of the incredible disasters. They even called it the Justinian Plague. They blamed him for it. They said his treatment of people, his taxation, all of his projects. They said he angered the gods, or this was still transitionary period. There were still people who were pagan worshippers. There's Christians. There's different views of Christianity. Anyway, they called it the Justinian Plague. It killed many people. That happened in the 540s. To create stability, Justinian instituted a new building program, a massive building program. In other words, keep people busy. Give people jobs, keep people busy, make it look like the government is working for them. He wanted to demonstrate his overpowering supremacy and, of course, his adherence to the religion, the Christian religion. He was sort of the leader of the church and also leader of the state. Probably the most spectacular of these building projects, which here's really ironic, of course. They didn't have the money to be doing these massive projects. Yet he was pouring the resources of his wars, all the lands he was conquering, he was pouring all those resources into these building projects. He wanted to demonstrate his supremacy, his religiosity. I like that. That's a good word. Not sure if that's a real word, but I'm going to go with it. That's a good one. The most spectacular of these projects was the Hagia Sophia. The reconstruction of this Church of the Holy Wisdom, the Hagia Sophia, which still stands today. It's been altered a little bit, but it still stands today as a wonder of the world, an incredible structure. As his empire went on, or as his reign went on, he became more and more autocratic. More and more, because the empire had so many problems, so many issues, constant. There was invasions and all these, again, the plague and riots and the rising inflation, all kinds of stuff, that he became much more autocratic, much more of a really dominant emperor. He eroded the economy of the cities. Pretty much the imperial bureaucracy came to dominate everything. The imperial bureaucracy came to dominate the entire empire, to where all decisions had to go through the official government channels. He does do actually something really interesting and significant. He codifies all the laws into a monumental codex. I don't know if I have it on here. Yeah, the codex. Codex in 534. This was completed in 534, and then to create a list of all the different legal cases, they condensed millions of regulations and laws into the digest in 533. Justinian's laws also outlaw homosexual relations for the first time in Roman history, which is also a change. He also tries to compel religious unity. He tries to really bring Eastern and Western Christianity together. They were like two like two similar paths. They had not completely separated yet, but already by the 5th century, 6th century, we could see Christianity starting to move in two different directions. Had the Roman Empire remained whole, this might not have happened. We might not have seen this fracture. But the fact that the empires, one pretty much fell and the other survived, Roman Catholic Christianity continued to grow and thrive in what was left of the Roman Empire and the rest of Europe, and Eastern Christianity takes a different course. He tries to bring them back together to try to unify them. Didn't work out, and ultimately they grow further and further apart. Within a couple hundred years, we see an official split. Somewhere in the 10th, 11th century, we'll see an official split in the Christian church. Now, this is the other part of that picture we saw with the Empress Theodora. This is the Emperor Justinian. Same thing. Same thing we have here. This is just the other half of it. The emperor with the halo around his head, with this court around him, his assistants, the priests. It's also interesting. On one side, we have soldiers, indicating Justinian has the authority over the government, over the military. On the other side, we have clergy. We have Christian officials, the church, which is what we would call Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Him standing in the middle indicates authority over both, authority over the secular and the sacred. Yes, there was technically a leader of the Christian church in Constantinople known as the Patriarch, but nonetheless, he still considered himself to be the authority over both sides, sacred and secular. He was a very, very much an autocrat, to where he held and believed he held all power. There was no semblance of senate. There was no division of power. No idea of any type of a government bureaucracy that did anything but simply obey his every word, his every commandment, if you will. All right, and the last thing we'll talk about is this preservation of classical traditions in the late Roman Empire. The Christianization of the empire endangered the survival of classic Latin and Greek literature, as polytheistic art and classical Latin and Greek, the whole Latin and Greek world was entirely tied up with classic Greek and Roman, Latin, and the Greek language. The culture and all of it was together. It was all part of, I guess that term I used earlier, Romanness, this idea of Romanness. Some people believe that it was subversive. It was a problem because the Roman culture was so heavily tied into polytheism. And with the Christianization of the empire, Roman culture starts to fall out of favor. And what we'll actually see is a new culture develops, an Eastern culture, which, when the Roman Empire fell in the West in the 400s, the Eastern Empire really started to mirror, this is before Justinian, really mirrored the ancient earlier Roman Empire. But within the next 100 years, because remember, this is Justinian, this is 100 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, Justinian has no interest in that anymore. Justinian and Byzantium altogether really starts to move Eastern, really starts to move and have more Eastern culture, more Eastern influences. And so not only is the Christian church separating, the culture is also changing. It's becoming more of an Eastern culture, pulling away from classical Roman art and things. Now, the most important of the time period was the classical texts. All of these writings and all of this knowledge, which was primarily written in Latin. Well, most of it gets translated into Greek because they want to sort of move away from the Latin, because that is the Roman culture, that's the old polytheistic culture, and they want to move more towards the Greek, which is the East, and is different than the old classic Roman culture. Latin and Greek scholarship survives. It is important. That continues to all through. That doesn't ever go away. I'm going to say it differently. It doesn't go away for a few centuries. Eventually, Latin, like today, Latin is a dead language. Latin is not a language spoken anywhere in the world. The only place Latin is found is basically within religious scripture, religious writings. You find it, of course, in the Catholic Church. And other than that, it's pretty much just found in some scholarly works. But really, Latin starts to fade away as they move away from it because it is too closely related to the polytheistic culture. So in this time period, Latin does still survive for a while because they do want to read the old texts, and much of the old texts are written in Latin. And Greek scholarship, of course, is important as well. Still, to have a government position in the Eastern Roman Empire still required you to be fluent in Latin and Greek. It was still part of an elite education, what we start to call a classical education. This is what even today we call it. If you go to university and you study the classics, that's actually a degree you can get, a degree in classics. You're basically going to be studying Roman and Greek languages, Latin, Greek, and probably some other, Romance languages, which, French and German and Spanish, whatnot. So, government and culture moves away from Latin, and even moves away from Latin and the whole polytheistic, but academics and the church still manage to hold on to it. The educated elite, which is a pretty small percentage. Between clergy and educated elite, you're talking about only a couple percent of the population. Another factor promoting this preservation of classical literature was the classical rhetoric. Think of like lawyers, educated people, debaters, whatnot. Debate and rhetoric had been the purview of philosophy in the Roman Empire and the Greeks. Well, now debate and rhetoric, the ability to speak and public speaking and having the ability to argue with someone, becomes the purview of the Christian church. It becomes about the most effective way to present Christian theology, especially with so many competing views of theology. Not even just among Christians, because then you also have competing theologies with paganism, Eastern religions. The Byzantine Empire ran into other Eastern religions, even going so far as, to Indian religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, stuff like that. Another factor promoting, I've got that. This growth of Christian literature generates technological innovations with the Codex, which was this book with, bound pages, a great improvement over the first book is what we would call it. They developed the first Western books, which they called the Codex, which was a group of pages that were bound together with a binding, which was much more easy to use and to read than a bunch of papyrus scrolls. This was, in essence, the invention of the book, at least in Western civilization. All right. And then we need to talk about how the Academy, after 1,000 years, finally closes. So, most vividly demonstrated with this being closed, this was Plato's school. Again, about 1,000 years. Many of the scholars had actually left. They had left the Roman Empire. They had gone to Persia due to all of the restrictions on polytheism. Because again, the Academy is really, it's a polytheistic philosophical school. Without any type of support. This is in Athens, Greece. With sort of the end of polytheism, and polytheism being pushed out of the empire, this was maybe the most well-known, quote-unquote university, what effectively is university in the Eastern Roman Empire, and it closes. So this is sort of an ending of one era, the end of Western Romanness and Roman culture, and the beginning of a more modern Eastern blending culture, trying to get away from the classical. And really it all has to do with Christianity. Christianity is really the reason behind all of this, with this moving away from this, because Rome is associated with polytheism. Eastern Roman Empire was pretty much entirely Christian. Here we have the Justinian, a page from the Code of Justinian. Interesting artwork. It's pretty. I like it. And then we have the Eastern Roman Empire at the ascension of Justinian. Pretty much Greece to Egypt into the Middle East. You can see the death of Justinian. He had added all the way to Italy, parts of Europe, and Northern Africa. He had expanded it. And interestingly enough, afterwards, it all goes away. It almost all goes away. So anyway, that takes us to the end of the chapter. Thanks for going with me, going through the whole thing with me. And it went a little longer than normal, but a lot of information. All right, we'll see you next week.